Welcome to the wood shop. Today we're going to build a sailboat. I created a scale model to try to pull our design from. I'm just kidding. Let's start with something small first. What we're looking at here is the Penobscot 17. It's a 17-foot sailboat, and we're going to be opting for the Gunter rig. What I really like about this rig is the overlapping planks. Gives it a real traditional look, even though it's made out of plywood. First step is going to be pulling all these patterns off the mylar paper here. That's going to be done using a sharp stick to poke through the paper and then onto the plywood, and then it's basically just connect the dots from there. Here it is all connected and ready to be cut out. I'm going to go ahead and use the jigsaw to kind of rough cut this out, make it easier to handle for the bandsaw. I believe this is going to be the stern stem. For those of you like myself who don't know anything about boats, this is I guess the very front of the boat. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just kind of figuring it out as I go. Then we go over to the bandsaw and cut it out. This is the newest tool in the shop, and holy cow, this thing has been incredibly helpful throughout this entire process. Definitely would not have been able to do this without this tool. Building the patterns out of cheap laminate plywood, just easier to work with than the white oak I plan on building this out of. Last step is taking over the sander so I can hide my poor skills with the bandsaw. And then we bring it over to the paper and see if it fits. Not bad for the first time. Now I've just got several more to go. You definitely don't want to watch me make several more patterns. So here's the rest of them. Includes the stern, the rudder, the centerboard, various bits and pieces of the centerboard case, several different bulkhead patterns, as well as the false keel that goes on the bottom. The stern is going to be made out of white oak. I don't know any white oak that grows in the shape of my pattern, so I had to split it in two. The stern will be 3 of these pieces thick, totaling out to be 6 pieces in total that I got to cut out of this stock. I believe the end thickness is somewhere in the ballpark of 2 inches. And then we bring that stock on over to the bandsaw and cut it out. The point of cutting this out is just to make it a little bit easier when we take it over to the router. So we're not trying to go straight to the line here. Here comes the shop helper to reluctantly take my scrap wood away. And there it is. We've created a very blunt sword. Shop dog does not look impressed. And just like that, we have one completed stern. That's some assembly required. Then I'm going to go ahead and rip a straight line using this track saw. Straight line is going to give me a really good glue edge when I glue these all together. Of course, this is always done under the watchful eye of the shop dog. Now it's time to do our first glue up. This 2-part epoxy. I think it's 5 to 1. Fun fact, that does not mean 5 pumps to 1 pump. It is in fact 1 to 1. I don't know who would make that mistake multiple times and wouldn't figure out why their epoxy wouldn't cure. Definitely wasn't me. The wax paper helps a little bit with it not sticking to the MDF that this is being glued on. The 6 pieces become 3, and they will cure overnight. Ready for the next step? We're going to take one of these pieces over the router table and use the pattern in a pattern tracing bit to get a more accurate cut. First we gotta plane down the epoxy so it's a little easier to cut. Remember how I said some of the epoxy didn't cure the first time? Turns out getting partially cured epoxy out of a planer is not so easy. Alright, epoxy fixed. Let's try this again. Much smoother. And then we can bring it over to the flush trim router bit, and with the pattern taped to the top of the stock wood, create the perfect outline of the pattern. Sorry for the poor angle here. I absolutely hate using the router. It scares the living hell out of me. So the camera was the least thing I was worried about at the time. Alright, then we're going to glue the three pieces together. That center piece is the only one that's been powder routed. Even though it's just epoxy, it brings out the grain pattern of that white oak pretty well. I'm looking forward to seeing what the finished product might look like. When that center piece has been pattern routed, we'll use the pattern router bit to trace the center one to match, have the other outside pieces match. I'm definitely not looking forward to that. Like I said, I hate the router, but it's a necessary evil. Once it's all clamped up, it will sit overnight and cure, hopefully. It's the next day and it has cured, and we're using the hand router this time with the same flush trim router bit. I like using the hand router over the router table because when the hard white oak grabs onto that bit, it doesn't send my hand straight into the spinning blades of death. That's always a positive in my book. On to creating the bevels for the end of the stem, using my sharp stick, also known as an awl, to punch holes into where the bevel should be going to. Then we'll use those holes to connect the dots and create our bevel line. I already marked the center line at the bottom of my hand there. That's where the bevel needs to go to. Just to make it easier to see, I'm just going over my pencil with a marker real quick. And these are the areas that need to be cut out. I'm going to use the power planer to make short work of this, and then later clean it up with the hand plane and then the smoothing plane. Give it a nice rounded decorative edge, as well as the scarf joint there at the top. Then once that's all done, we'll set it aside and start working on the centerboard case. Centerboard is comprised of two plywood pieces. Sandwiched between them are two spacers that go on the outside that allow the centerboard to fold out and fold back in with ease. Once those pieces are created, I fiberglass the inside of the centerboard, just because they're going to see a lot of wear and tear. I also added some anti-fouling paint, just to make sure there's no bacterial growth in there. It's going to be really hard to access later down the line and clean. Probably a good time to mention that the entire boat is made from white oak and some marine grade plywood. There's a little bit of pine in there for some of the parts that require a little more bend, as well as all stainless steel or bronze hardware. Last part of the centerboard for now is just adding these outside white oak strips and then giving them a little bit of a round over. Just makes them that much nicer to look at. Once we're done with this, we'll set it aside with the stem and start working on the bulkheads. With the patterns already created, I'm going to lay them out on this plywood. Try to get the most out of this plywood because it is rather expensive stuff. Then using the track saw, we're going to rough cut these bulkheads out so that it's easier to bring these over to the bandsaw. Today I got my buddy helping me today, and he is cutting these out of the bandsaw. Once again, we're not trying to get right on the line, just close enough that we can use the pattern bit to knock out the rest of it. The same process as the stem, we tape the pattern to the top of the blank and use the pattern bit to trace it out. This is much more enjoyable because the plywood is not as hard and it doesn't get bound up in the bit as much. Significantly less danger feeling over the white oak. And using the hammer and chisel to get those sharp corners where the planks overlap. You line up the bulkhead to its corresponding blueprint. And this blueprint has this line at the bottom that you use to measure your spacers out correctly so that everything sits correctly once you put it all up on the strongback. Now onto the strongback. We use 2x6s here and screwed them into place with some deck screws. I'm hoping to reuse these as part of the mast structure. Then we add some wheels because I know I'm going to want to be able to move this around the shop a little bit. This boat takes up a lot of space. Using the most obnoxious string I could find, put a center line down the middle, just so that everything sits flush when we start putting the bulkheads on. Cut a groove for the string to sit up in there, out of the way. Then following the plans, we marked where each bulkhead is supposed to be on the strongback, and got to screwing them in place. It was at this point that we realized just how big this thing is. I opted to go with the 17-foot boat. Everybody says that once you put a boat in the water, it becomes much smaller. But wow, this thing is large. One thing I noticed right away is it's really hard to put this thing in scale. Luckily, I have the universal measuring stick of one friend to put on the ground. Give you guys a sense of idea of how large this thing is. with the assistance of Shop Dog. We're going to make sure everything's square before we start adding some more bracing. It's really important that these bulkheads sit parallel to each other for future steps. And then we're on to the shear strake. This is the first of the stringers that go on the boat. These ultimately need to sit flush inside the bulkheads. But first I gotta get them on there to see where they land, and then I can scribe them into the bulkheads. I quickly learned that the vast majority of boat building is putting the piece on, taking it off, putting it back on again, taking it off again, putting it back on again, taking it back off again, and then eventually gluing it in place. Cutting all the stringer locations out of the bulkhead starts with a little saw and usually ends with a rasp to try to get that bevel for the stringer to sit perfectly. Sometimes I also use a scroll saw to get up in there. By the end of this process, I got real sick of doing this. I think it's well over probably 20 to 30 cuts I had to do total. And of course, none of them are straight or parallel in any way, and are pretty much just scribed in place. Here we are putting the shear strake back on. Don't worry, we'll have to take it off again before we put it back on again. Me and angles don't really get along. I pretty much fried my brain trying to figure this out the first time. And eventually it clicked, and then the other 16 of these stringers I had to do were significantly easier. Didn't help, this is the first time I used a bevel gauge, and I couldn't figure that out to save my life. Once that was cut, I drilled and counter drilled the pilot holes. Then I'll use, in this case, some drywall screws. They're just much more durable than the stainless steel screws, which they will eventually be replaced with. Those stainless steel screws really like to strip, and they're quite expensive, so I try to avoid using them when I know I'm going to have to take that piece out again anyways. Once the shear strakes are put in place, this is what we're left with. You can also see the stem that we worked on earlier, as well as the centerboard case, roughly fitted in place. Now it's time to fit the keel. Gotta cut the bevel at the end of the transom here, where the keel will terminate. Like a glove. And then we're gonna screw it down with those drywall screws for now. Then later we'll come in and the stainless steel screws in and epoxy pieces together. And this is where we're at this point, with the keel attached to the centerboard case, as well as to the transom via this knee that I made. Now I just have to repeat that process at least a dozen more times. Securely screw the stringer to the bulkhead, scribe it in place. Then cut out where I scribed. Hit it with a rasp just a little bit just to get the bevel correct. And then bang it into place with a hammer. When attaching the stringer to the stem, you have to perform a minor amount of witchcraft using angles to get this right. Still not really sure how this worked. Some of these you see are getting steam bent. They need a little bit of a twist to meet up with the stem. And then we'll cut it. Clean it up with the plane just a little bit. Before screwing it temporarily into place. The back side, you just trim off the extra. Rinse and repeat that process 14 times over the next month, and this is what we're sitting at. It's starting to look like a boat now. Before we can start planking, we got to get the stem facing done. This is basically the beginning of the false keel. It's done by laminating a bunch of really thin slices of white oak over the existing stem. Here's an example of the thin piece of wood I used to create this. Once the epoxy is cured, we stick it to the planer and clean it up. Thankfully this time the epoxy was fully cured and didn't leave a huge mess on my planer blades. Once that's done, we'll set that aside because we're not going to need it for a very long time. Finally, on to the bane of my existence, planking. This took me probably 2 months to do. It starts with putting the piece of plywood where you want your plank to go and scribing it into place based on the stringers. The bottom stringer can be left a little loose because we're going to flush trim that up in a bit here. Each plank consisted of 3 of these plywood pieces that have to be scarfed together using this scarfing jig. And then I bring it over to the bandsaw where I cut it out along that line that I had scribed earlier. And we bring it back on over to the boat where we drill and screw it back onto the boat for a final fit before epoxy coating the inside of these. Once the epoxy is cured, come back with a block plane and clean up those edges so it's flush with the keel. Before lastly using the flush trim router bit to trim up that bottom piece so it's flush with the stringer. Here's what it looks like after we've did a couple of them. He's just trying to make sure it's nice and level, so when we put the keel on there, it lays flat. Now we just rinse and repeat that same process 7 times per side for a total of 14 planks, each having 3 sections. This took a god-awful amount of time, and I would not want to do this again. With the planking mostly done, decided to move on to the keel. Originally I used a laser level and cardboard to try to make a template to then turn into a routed template. However, the cardboard turned out to be way too flimsy and I ended up using just regular pieces of wood. Once the template was created, I taped it to the stock wood, rough cut it with the bandsaw, and here's what I'm left with. Learned my lesson from the flush trim bit before, and I'm knocking down as much as I can with the hand plane before bringing it over to the pattern bit. Most of the material removed with the hand plane bit. I used the pattern trim bit this time. It was much easier to cut it than it was the first time I tried doing this. Then we just remove the pattern, and here's what we're left with. The keel was done in 2 major parts with 3 pieces each to get the right thickness, and they were glued together the same way as the stem, with the center one being routed, and then once it's dried, you use that center piece to trace the outer pieces. Then I epoxied them to the hull using this elaborate clamping system. Before finishing, I filled every single gap with a 2-part fairing compound epoxy, then sanded it away. And I coated the entire outside of the hull with a couple layers of epoxy to seal the wood in. This is what we're left with. It's pretty shiny, and I sanded it before moving on to painting. I started with a few coats of primer. That bottom plank is masked off and it will be varnished at some point. In between this primer coat and the top coat, I actually did a light layer of anti-fouling paint along the waterline. Once that process was finished, I caulked some of the gaps in the more noticeable parts between the planks and put the top coat on. Unmasking something is always super satisfying, and here I am taking off the masking paper for the bottom plank with the assistance of the captain. At this point, the boat is pretty much ready to flip, and I've added this sacrificial rubbing strip along the top there. Before flipping the boat, I have to take it off the strongback and repurpose some of this wood for the cradle for when the boat gets flipped over, it can have somewhere to sit. Under the watchful eye of the captain, I enacted a little bit of boat yoga to scoop the strongback out while the front of the boat is propped up on some wood. My buddy and I slapped together a quick little cradle from scrap wood and started attaching wheels to it. Once the cradle was completed, we took it off and flipped it over, ready to receive the boat.
Come back toward me and roll. Yeah. All right, ready? Holy shit! Okay.
You're so far away.
Oh my god. That's pretty heavy.
Alright, gonna do this. Easy, buddy. Oh yeah.
After months and months of working on this, we were obviously pretty excited to flip it. There's no real elegant way that we could think of to flip it, so we just rolled it, and that seemed to work out pretty well. The specs say that it's supposed to be about 300 pounds. I'm hoping it's still going to be launchable by beach instead of having to use a boat launch. But we will see. And here's where the project stands now. For the first time ever building a boat, I think this turned out pretty well. And in the next video we will tackle the interior of it. I think the captain is impressed with her vessel. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time in the shop.